session 5, and we apologize for taking so much time. This is the session on good governance, leadership, and people-centered development in Africa. I now hand over to our moderator, Mr. Chenje. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tamrat, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, UN Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor on Africa to the Secretary General, Vince Gawanas, thank you for inviting me to participate in this year's Africa Dialogue Series. Thank you and your staff for the excellent planning and rehearsals to make sure that we have a fantastic session. It is a privilege and an honor for me to moderate this session on good governance, leadership, and people-centered sustainable development in Africa. To contribute to this year's theme of the Africa Dialogue Series, COVID-19 and silencing the guns in Africa, the challenges and opportunities that we face. This session builds on the previous sessions, in particular the last one, and I would also want to acknowledge the rich discussions that have gone on since yesterday and today. It is also a privilege to be the moderator of this session with such distinguished and illustrious panel comprised of our lead presenter, Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, and our discussants, Her Excellency Mrs. Minata Samate Sesuma, the AU Commissioner for Political Affairs, and of course, my sister, Under Secretary General and Special Advisor to the SG, Ms. Gawanas, and Mr. Brian Kagoro, the Programs Director of the Africa Regional Office of the Open Society Foundation. This year's Africa Dialogue Series seek to amplify the call made by our Secretary General for complete and total ceasefire of all conflicts around the world, including in our region, and focus on battling the COVID-19 pandemic. The same call was echoed by the chairperson of the AU Commission. This session will discuss the critical role of good governance to silencing the guns in the long term, including in the area of natural resource management, and the importance of leadership in fostering good governance at all levels for shared opportunities and prosperity. It will identify good practices and lessons learned coming from successful real cases, experiences, and projects. All these issues are critical to the successful implementation of the 2030 Agenda, the SDGs, and for Africa, Agenda 2063, as well as the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and more recently for the UN Socio-Economic Framework in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Good governance, leadership, and people-centered sustainable development in Africa are critical for us to beat back the pandemic and build back better for transformative change in Africa. African countries have over time built strong institutions and systems to manage diversity, encourage participation, encourage regional integration, and promote sustainable development. The region has systems of democratic governance that have broadened competitive politics, strengthened leadership transitions, invigorated civic action, and renewed economies for growth and sustainable development. Sadly, there are some parts of the region where we still face violent conflicts, insecurity, and instability. Some countries are grappling with humanitarian crises due to different factors such as political tensions, insecurity, and displacements. The implementation of the 2030 Agenda, SDGs, and Agenda 2063 remains a challenge. Progress is mixed. Good governance and people-centered leadership are critical factors to silencing the guns in Africa. They also mean ensuring that no one is left behind, the central promise of the 2030 Agenda. If we in Africa we are to win this battle again against the pandemic, if we are to attain lasting peace, it is important to address the complex issues of vulnerabilities, inequalities, and marginalization. This session seeks to highlight the critical importance, again, of good governance, not only for the immediate response to the socio-economic impacts, to the health impacts, to the humanitarian impacts of the pandemic, but also towards building transformative change, building sustainability, nurturing peace, which will transform our societies. Without further ado, it is my singular honor to invite Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, the Director of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, to take the floor and lead our conversation on this topic. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairperson. And let me begin by, first of all, standing on all of the existing protocols, but in doing so, extend a special word of congratulations and appreciation to the Special Advisor on Africa, Under Secretary General Vince Gawanas, for putting together such an excellent initiative and a rich program. I couldn't agree with you more, Chair, that much of the conversation that has taken place since yesterday was actually broached on the issue of governance and its centrality in a lot of the issues that have arisen around peace building and citizen welfare in the various panels, including especially, as you rightly mentioned, the panel that immediately preceded this one. I would like, in the context of all of what has been said, to begin perhaps with a slight reminder, Chair, because our panel is titled Good Governance. And it's easy to assume that the concept itself is one around which there is a universal consensus. Sometimes, in fact, the notion of the good in the governance is used as a code word, a polite code word, not to say something terribly nasty about the way in which countries of the region of Africa or elsewhere, especially in the global south, administer themselves. I take a much broader approach to the concept of governance, and I'd like to lay it out for starters by placing it in the context of debates as they developed in the 1990s, by reminding us that actually we have come a long way from the period when there was almost an instinctive assumption, especially in the context of the crisis of the 1980s in Africa, that the challenge to Africa's development could only be understood in purely narrow economic or economistic terms, summarized at the time by the slogan of getting prices right, which again was simply a code for market liberalization as a mechanism for setting values and the parameters for those values in economy and society. And I say we've come a long way from it because now there is a broadly shared recognition that in fact, and perhaps more importantly than getting prices right as such, is the necessity for the countries of the continent to get the politics right. And this is not something which was alien to African social scientists, because as far back again as the 1980s, in the context of some of the discontents of post-colonial development, many scholars on the continent had in fact started to ask the question of what went wrong with the project of independence on our continent, and how could that project be brought back on course, especially around the goals that underpinned the struggles for national liberation, goals of developmental transformation, goals of nation building and of national unity, goals around state building, and of finding a rightful place for our continent in the Community of Nations. And in the context of that debate, or the questions which were asked, of course there was a recognition that Africa was confronted with economic systems that were not properly functional and adapted to the needs of society and the ambition for transformation. But within that recognition, there was also a growing conversation around the fact that soon after the independence, most African countries began to get the politics wrong. And at the heart of getting the politics wrong were issues which eventually came to be encapsulated under the broad label of governance. So that in a certain sense, when we speak about getting the politics right as a starting point for developmental transformation, we also invariably broach upon the issues of governance that are, in fact, in a certain sense, unavoidable in any project of national transformation, whether it be in Africa or elsewhere. And I think it is fair to say that it is the story of nations. When we look at the most successful nations in the recent history of the world, that the starting point for their successful projects of transformation was in fact getting the governance equation right. And here, therefore, I want to locate the concept of governance, not so much in terms of its technical and technocratic rendition, in the way in which it has been promoted in much of the technical literature around issues of a very narrow technocratic type that are measured in order to produce indexes of good governance. But more pertinently, I would suggest that we locate it in the context of the dynamics of state-society relations, of the way in which the relationship between the state and society are articulated as to make for an effective administration that underpins a vision of national transformation. And that broad definition of governance within a state-society dynamic enables us to begin to look at the ways in which for each season, at each time, nations organized around a compact between the state and society attempt to build progress, to confer authority, to challenge the misuse of authority, promote accountability, build predictability into the political system. For me, that notion of the compact between state and society provides an essential underlying key to understanding some of the discontents which we have subsequently witnessed across the continent. And to be fair, these are not discontents that are new or which started yesterday. It began soon after independence, actually, when in the course of prosecuting the nation building and the state building agenda, we saw a gradual erosion of what in the previous panel was referred to as the trust that was needed between the people and their leadership, between the state and society. An erosion of trust which accumulated over time as to produce a series of discontents that ultimately, left unmanaged or poorly managed, became the sources of some of the conflicts that resulted in the worst cases in the collapse of central governmental authority or in intra-country conflicts and wars of the kinds which we witnessed in Africa intermittently after independence, and particularly in the 80s and 90s, when the continent was ravaged by many conflicts of a violent nature. Even as we speak, we are talking of not less than 20 to 21 active conflicts that are going on our continent, speaking again to the fray in the state-society compact that is so crucial to successful governance and therefore of developmental transformation. I think in many respects what we are confronted with in talking about a frayed social compact between state and society is in fact a series of underlying contradictions which confront expectations of a legitimate nature from citizens against the failings of states after independence. To again use the language from the previous panel, when Michelle Njai talked about the failures of service delivery, of that disconnect between legitimate citizen aspiration and expectation of what ought to be delivered as part of a broad state-society compact, and what in fact the state did deliver or failed to deliver, as to erode first the legitimacy of the state, and secondly, the trust of the citizenry in the capacity of the state to meet their basic concerns.
If I may just remind you, Professor, to start wrapping up. Thank you.
Yes, and in all of this, I think what we see has been an inability of leadership, especially of leadership vision, to be executed in a way, in a sustained way, that can help to address some of the problems of disconnect which we have witnessed. Leadership which in a lot of cases in the face of crisis has tended to resort to the kinds of authoritarian governance simply led to a further deepening of the discontent in state and society. And when I speak of leadership as an important part of the broader governance equation and of the vision of leadership as being a critical component of that entire process, it seems to me that in the context of the current challenges which we are faced with, one of the biggest issues on the agenda of the continent in terms of giving content and meaning to citizenship, and therefore rebuilding a basis for state-society relations, will be the question of bringing back the social state, of a state which in fact defines ab initio the welfare and well-being of citizens in a way that enables them to be empowered to call government to account as primary order of business, which in fact has also been exposed by the way in which we have gone about managing the pandemic. On the face of things, when we look at the responses which have been undertaken across the continent, one would in fact want to celebrate that African leaders quite swiftly and uniformly moved to take intervention measures, perhaps of a nature that has been too uniform and too similar for comfort. But yes, the lockdowns, yes, the emergency provisions, and yes, some of the palliatives that were introduced in order to mitigate the consequences of the lockdowns that were implemented. At the same time, we are confronted with the cumulative consequences of a lack of investment in the social sectors, particularly in this instance of the health sector, side by side with problems of poverty and inequality of an enduring nature that basically meant that a lockdown confronted the average citizen in many of our countries with a choice between dying of a virus or dying of hunger. You would have seen the demonstrations that took place in many of the cities of our continent, basically challenging the lockdown provisions or simply ignoring them and going about business as though government directives did not really matter in order to eke out a living in the context of a very severe social and economic situation. And so I would argue that part of the challenge which we need to begin to address our minds to in a meaningful way is how to bring back the notion of a full citizenship embedded in a renewed state society compact as a key underlying principle of an attempt at renewal in a post-COVID-19 Africa, of a state society dynamic with privileges the aspirations of the citizen as the fulcrum around which governance processes and structures are built, and which may feed into broader ambitions such as the SDGs, but which ultimately must respond in the first instance to the need for citizens not only to have a renewed faith in government locally, but also to be able to exercise agency in calling government to order in the implementation of a broader and broadly shared vision of societal transformation. I thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Professor Olukoshi. You raised very important points of the frayed state society compact and the need to bring that back in the fight against the pandemic, and also in building bigger visions of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Without further ado, I would like to now invite our first discussant, Her Excellency, Mrs. Minata Samate Susuma. You have the floor.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol duly observed. I'm sorry to join you late because we have an heavy rain in Addis and we don't have internet because of this rain. But let me first congratulate the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, my sister Gawana, for organizing this pertinent and timely virtual dialogue series on COVID-19 and silencing the guns in Africa, the challenges and opportunities. This session is pertinent because it addresses the fundamental structural factors inhibiting Africa's progress on three main fronts, namely democracy and governance, peace and security, social economic development, and structural transformation. These are the three bases upon which Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, is firmly anchored. Agenda 2063, with its 7 aspirations, is fully aligned with the 2030 Global Agenda on Sustainable Development with its 17 SDGs. I have structured my intervention around the above pillars. Firstly, I lost some presentation, but I suppose it was about the root causes of conflict, of bad governance. And firstly, I would like to focus on violent conflict on the continent which are propelled by poor governance, weak public institution, and Michel mentioned it, and lack of visionary and transformative leadership at various layers of society in Africa. This poses a challenge for us to find practical means of assisting the member states of AU in their effort to entrench democracy and governance in line with 2007 African Charter on Democracy, Election, and Governance. In doing this, we will be striving towards the achievement of Aspiration 3 of Agenda 2063, which envisions an Africa of good governance, democracy, and respect of human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Secondly, the root causes of Africa's problem are propelled by terrorism, violence, extremism, intercommunal conflict, and trusted strife, all of which have exacerbated human rights violation and forced displacement on the continent, compounded by adverse effects of climate change. Africa hosts millions of refugees, IDPs, and stateless persons. It is important that AU member states effectively implement the provision of the 2002 Protocol on Establishment of AU Peace and Security Council for a peaceful and secure Africa. Equally important is putting emphasis on root causes which stem from governance issue, socio-economic injustice, and shortfalls in the rule of law. It is therefore worth emphasizing that Aspiration 3 and 4 of Agenda 2063 resonate with 2030 Global Agenda on Sustainable Development. In particular, they dovetail neatly into SDG number 16, which aim to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. Thirdly, key structural factors for violence and instability in Africa have to do with underdevelopment, poverty, hunger, inequality, corruption, unemployment, which are worsened by the onset of COVID-19. It is therefore important to address weakness of public service delivery, and Michel mentioned it. This explains why out of 7 aspirations of Agenda 2063, 5 are dedicated to socio-economic development and structural transformation. Fourthly, prioritization of both APSA and AGA. The African governance architecture is one of the main tools which is helping to realize these aspirations. While referencing the African peace and security architecture in the concept note of this meeting, I realized that AGA was not mentioned at all. If the African Union architecture tool that means to address the root causes of armed conflict is not also prioritized, we may find it difficult to silence the guns in Africa as planned. Fifthly, implication of COVID-19 on democracy in Africa in relation to election. Yesterday, some panelists mentioned that at least 18 or 20 elections are scheduled to take place on the continent in 2020. However, the effect of COVID-19 pandemic on the electoral processes in Africa raises concern among the constitutional dilemma linked to fundamental legal provision for term limitation on elective office. In context where incumbents are completing their final term, election postponement may engender a constitutional crisis. In that case, it is necessary to ensure that all decisions relating to the postponement or the holding of election in time of health crisis comply with constitutional provision of the state.
Your Excellency, you have 2 minutes.
Let me just take account what a person mentioned. It is to consider that a cross-cutting. An important point for me is to consider cross-cutting good governance and called on the people centered on development with the full participation of women. Women are therefore very important. They shouldn't be left behind. Women therefore should and must be integral part of these governance strategies, including political leadership processes. This gives me occasion and opportunity to announce that AU DPA and with UNDP will soon launch an initiative called AU-UN Initiative in Governance and Political Participation under the COVID-19. To conclude, it is worth noting that 2020 Africa is confronted with a double jeopardy: the imperative of silencing the guns and containing the COVID pandemic. In addressing both challenges, clear strategic focus should be on the advancement of democratic governance and calculating a culture of peace and putting bread on the table to address anger. This requires fundamentally a visionary and transformative leadership, effective, strong institution, and vibrant citizenry. These are my comment on the theme, and I thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for the points that you have raised and the emphasis that you've placed on good governance and the participation of women in contributing to making change in Africa. It is now my privilege and honor to call upon Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Special Advisor to the SG, my sister, Bince Kawanas. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, my brother. And without further ado, knowing time is not on our side, I don't know whether I will maybe raise more questions than answers. And I want to start off by thanking Adebayo for raising the issue of the state-society relations and the issue of compact. Because what I am trying to understand is that elections are not just a process. People go to vote because they want to put their trust in a leadership that can deliver for them. Once that trust is broken, the state-society relationships therefore also become broken. And therefore, I think it is important that when we discuss governance, that we do not lose sight of the fact that it's not a structure issue, it's not a process issue, it's a people's issue. It's about delivering basic services to people. When we continue to talk about a rich continent and poor people, that is when one asks oneself, how do we govern in a way that resources of the state are not used to create a better life for people? So I don't see elections as just a process where we invest a lot of money in the electoral process, but we do not invest a lot of money in what happens after elections and between elections. So I just wanted to pick up on the issue of state-society relations and the question of trust. The second issue I want to touch on is whenever I have engagement with youth, and youth keep on talking about we want to be leaders, then I constantly ask them, what type of leaders do you want to be? And so it is not just leading, it's about how you lead. And we are thrown around words like visionary leadership, leadership with integrity, transformative leadership. But I also want to add, I want to see leadership that has got empathy and compassion for the people that they are leading. When they see poverty, when they see people that have no water and sanitation, that should be an issue that must work on the conscience of leaders. So leadership is an issue that we really need to look at. I have talked about the state and society relations and the question of trust. And even in this, especially in this COVID-19 era, I believe that if people have trust in their leaders, then they will not question some of the actions that are being taken. But it's sometimes a lack of trust that are people doing the right thing for the right reasons. So then the next matter that I want to look at is questions of the rule of law and human rights. I think yesterday or earlier we talked about the right to health, and it becomes more pronounced in the context of COVID-19. The fact that people did not even have access to basic necessities must raise questions as to what extent can people really exercise their right to health. There was mention about women. I would rather put it within the context of gender equality on the continent. That we had been talking about gender equality for the longest of time, and yet we still fail to deliver women leaders on the continent. And I'm asking myself, why not? Are women not capable to lead? And we would always hear the argument that even though the majority of people that are electing are women, they don't necessarily elect women into power. But I think that kind of discourse is a discourse that we need to really ask ourselves whether it is still relevant in today's world. Then I also want to look at institutions. Leaders come and go, but institutions remain. And one of the challenges that we have on the continent is that we do not invest enough in the institutions that can help us to uphold the rule of law, that can help us to protect the rights and welfare of the people. This includes, amongst others, independent judiciary, because something that I have come to appreciate was the fact that rather than going onto the streets to fight the outcome of elections, that people have at least the ability to trust their judiciary and then go to courts to challenge the outcome of elections. But that is also going to be a question of how much trust they have in the institutions of government. So it is, for me, at the end of the day, governance is not just a concept that exists in isolation to the people in a country. And that's why you will see that it was about governance, about leadership and sustainable development. Integrity for me becomes very, very critical, because when we say we do not have enough money to even provide basic social services, or we do not have enough money to provide social protection for people. Yet, when I look at the extent of corruption and how corruption actually erodes public services and the ability of governments to deliver basic services to their people. I think earlier Ahuna talked about capable state. Adebayo talked about the social state, and these ones are issues that we definitely need to pay closer attention to if we really want to give meaning to governance. I want to conclude by saying, as I said at the beginning, it's not about merely institutions and processes, but it's at the end of the day about people, and how people put trust in their governments is when governments provide them with their basic necessities in life. I thank you.
Thank you so much for staying within time and also raising quite pertinent issues which we need to take into account as we prepare to go into broader discussion with participants, the issues that we're not dealing with our process, we're dealing with people, we're dealing with issues of leadership who have empathy and compassion for the people they lead. And that is not just a case of leadership, but also how we lead. And so our final discussant is Mr. Brian Kagoro. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Under Secretary General Pins Gawanas, and the OSAA team for this kind invitation, and to my fellow distinguished panelists and participants. They have raised a wide range of issues, including constitutionalism, governance, democracy, rule of law and human rights, terrorism, violent extremism, ecological injustice and climate change, poverty and inequality, socioeconomic and political injustice, including natural resource diversity management and inclusion, including the issue of youth and gender. They've also raised the issue of grant corruption, and one assumes also the question of state capture. But I want to add a few things to this, because a conversation about governance is a conversation about not just the state, it's a conversation about the broader polity and how it uses processes, institutions, and resources to achieve certain outcomes. And in this particular instance, I align myself to the earlier presentations by Professor Olukoshi that looks at, I think when we discuss African governments, it's useful for us to discuss the internal contradictions of a predatory elite. And in these days, it's now common parlance to talk of state capture. But if you are to talk about state capture, you have to add into the matrix of talking about governance the role of big corporations, right? Whether you call them transnational, multinational, and then the role of foreign interests, whether they are imperial, they are private, or they are new foreign interests. And the third, so that you have several dimensions of governance and democracy. You have the economic dimensions, which are about economic inclusion and ownership. You have the ecological dimensions, which are about intergenerational equity. You have also dimensions that are political, which my colleagues have referred to. And it is in the dimension of the second plane, which is Africa's relationship with society as preconditioned by African leadership relationship with multinational corporations and foreign interests, that some of the glorious ambitions that are expressed in the African Charter on Popular Participation, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and other instruments are often subverted. Subverted because the leadership is more connected to these foreign interests, whether they're international financial interests, they're finance capital interests, or they're purely political. A lot more connected and accountable to these than it is to the citizenry. So the issue of centering citizens, or putting citizens at the center of not just sustainable development, but of governance, requires, Chairperson, that we address the transnational dimensions of governance as they have an impact on the local and national, as well as the continental. Some of the dysfunctions that we see in regional and sub-regional and continental organizations is orchestrated from outside of the continent. And because of the weak linkage sometimes between those structures and the broad generality of African citizens, you have no mediating power, the popular power that Kwame Nkrumah used to talk about. which therefore brings me to how has the pandemic COVID-19 reshaped our moment? Clearly, as Professor Olukoshi says, the militarization and biomedicalization of the response has essentially ended with a perverse situation where we prevent the virus from spreading, but we also construct a new autocracy, right? That is able to keep surveillance over citizens, able to make decisions based on executive diktat without accountability to citizens, able to procure without the pain of going through public procurement or parliamentary oversight of procurement. So part of the challenge of conceptualizing governance post-COVID is the moment that permitted quick executive decisions needed to stop a pandemic may have created an appetite that goes beyond the accountability that we think about. The second component is surveillance, that the surveillance necessary in order to avert the spread of infections may become itself license for further intrusion in the privacy of those who are deemed to be opposed to or even just citizens. The third is the control of technology that we use for this meeting, the technology that we use now to transact in business, does not lie in Africa. So Africa will become a huge consumer, right? Because we have not enabled our own citizens to produce the platforms and the technologies that we need to survive this moment. So as we celebrate new tools, each time African leaders meet on Zoom, they meet on another social platform, they are making an American or a British a multi-billionaire. So the question that we have for governance is in the governance of technology. It is not just its positive components or its negative intrusive components that we must be thinking about. We must be thinking about its localization, its indigenization, so that in this moment, progress is not a fake notion of this hyper-consumerism by Africans who are able, like Europeans and Asians, to use a platform that is not their own. So part of what is challenging governance, Chairperson, is a new imagination. The third is how we handle citizenship in the context where citizens have been constructed as a potential danger to each other, to the state. And we have limited travel, we have limited interaction. What is the meaning of regional integration? What is the meaning of free trade that restrains and constrains the ability of African citizens to move? Will governance work effectively for us without human beings or without the citizens? Let me prepare to land, Chair, by saying the growth of authoritarianism is not our biggest danger. Our biggest danger is the growth of political and economic amnesia. Much of what we describe as the social problem in Africa is not poverty, but impoverishment because of economic policies that were inappropriate for our people, for our nations, but that were imposed on us. Is inappropriateness of social policies that we adopted. And the true transformative governance and leadership that Africa needs is a leadership that goes back to social and economic policies that transform the lives of Africans from being mere consumers, from being mere recipients of development, to being authors, co-creators, and participants in this development. Without that, Chairperson, we will survive COVID, the pandemic, but we will have died a deeper death in the sense that we will have constructed a continent which is unable to respond to exogenous shocks using its own people, its own indigenous resources, but depends either on charity or depends on foreign solutions. So part of the leadership we need is a solution-minded leadership that focuses on homegrown solutions, that focuses on African people as the premier instrument for transformation. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kagoro, for those thought-provoking contributions that you made in terms of where we stand in Africa, the issues of consumerism, the issues of technology, governance of technology, and the policies that we have adopted over time and their impact on our societies. So now we, after the contribution from our lead presenter and discussants, it's an opportunity for us to get contributions and comments from the floor. And I would like to invite to kick us off this particular session. It's comment from Mr. Omar Kadiri, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Morocco, Kingdom of Morocco. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I would like to thank the panelists for their rich insights and interesting presentations on this important thematic, tackling good governance, leadership, and people-centered development. This session brings in my point of view, not only three crucial enablers for sustainable development, but also key factors for framing an effective response to the current COVID-19 crisis. I have a few comments to make while a lot have been said on these thematics. First, as the African continent is facing the devastating effects of COVID-19 pandemic, it is important that policies are adapted to the new era imposed by the pandemic. What the pandemic has also shown us, for example, is the necessity to invest further in the health sector, which is an integral part of the SDGs. And I think some of the panelists raised this issue. What also the pandemic has shown us is that how new information and communication technologies are crucial in the post-COVID era. These technologies have kept us connected while we are physically distant. So it is extremely important as an African continent that we, in the post-COVID era, that we invest on these crucial issues. Another point is that we absolutely need an unprecedented level of coordinated action that puts the people at the center of the national priorities and that focuses on improving local communities' well-being, especially those who are in vulnerable situations. One issue that was raised by many panelists is the issue of the importance of promoting gender equality and the promotion of women's participation in all economic, social, and political and all life spheres. This is fundamental and is a priority for promoting democracy, good governance, and sustainable development in our continent. Another point is that Africa is a young continent, and that is why establishing policies that focus on youth, ensuring their inclusion in full sectors of society is of utmost importance. I would also like to stress the importance of investing in good governance, not only for the public administrations and institutions, but also with regards to the private sector. This is also a key issue in the post-COVID era. There is also a need to raise awareness and public education at the regional, national, and local levels on the current threats and challenges facing the continent's ability to achieve sustainable development, but also on the new reality that we face post-COVID. Finally, I would like to insist on the importance of multilateralism, as our interconnectedness is evident today more than ever before. Pursuing our path towards sustainable development requires strengthening the culture of multilateralism, enforcing regional integration, and uplifting the culture of the global common good. I would like also to end by, while speaking at the national, regional levels, the international level is extremely important also. And as we kickstart in 2020, the decade of action to implementing the SDGs, international solidarity, in particular with the African continent, is a necessity and extremely important to achieve the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kadiri. I don't see any other questions, but I have here a comment and some comments from Mr. Victor Ayeni. Would you like to take the floor?
You would have to read the questions. I don't think he has access to the platform.
Okay. So This was a comment, and then 3 questions that he highlighted. First, congratulations to Undersecretary General Gawanas and to the lead and the discussants. I accept what has been said, but it may help if we also look at what we have achieved so we know what we need to leverage and need to build on. Ultimately, governance and leadership is about drilling down on what specific actions otherwise will become abstract. 3 questions come to mind. 1, what should be done to improve citizens' trust in leadership? 2, what institutions must we have and should zero on if we are to contain conflict, which is sometimes driven by greed and opportunism? And 3, why do help African leaders from raising unrealistic expectations? I think the question is, why do we need African leaders to raise unrealistic expectations? I think there's a word missing there. So those were the 3 questions from Mr. Victor Ayeni. And those are the last comments that we had. So I'd like to give the opportunity back to Professor Olukoshi, and then also to the discussions if I have some additional points to address from the comments that we've heard from Mr. Kadiri and also what we have just read out. Over to you, Professor.
Fellow panelists, thank you to the fellow panelists for the various points which they raised, and most of which I can identify myself with. I think particularly the observation which was made by Commissioner Minata about the central place of women, and I will add also the youth, which was brought upon by the Deputy Permanent Rep of Morocco as part of a rebuilding that we need to embark upon on the continent. Happily, I think we now inhabit a moment where the issue of women's participation on equal terms is no longer a subject of frivolous debate and discussion. And some useful steps are being taken to demonstrate the workability of equal participation. I would, in fact, include that as part of the building blocks for a new social compact for our continent for many reasons, including the kinds of benefits which it can bring to a more effective governance of national territorial spaces on the continent. And that also goes for the youth. And I think here, perhaps, it's also useful for us to keep in mind that the issue with the African youth is not so much a question of not knowing what they need or what is right for them, but actually getting the empowerment that is necessary, or in the worst case scenario, actually seizing the initiative in order to effectively lead from the front in the project of transformation that is beckoning to us on the continent. If you look at much of the narrative around Africa Rising, you'll find that that narrative was really not so much about that section of our demographics that comprises the overwhelming majority of the continent, and which has actually taken a beating in terms of long-term unemployment, lack of access to assets and investable opportunities and the like, and whatever success is registered by dint of personal and group initiatives undertaken under sometimes fairly tough and difficult conditions. I think creating that enabling environment as a deliberate project of society as a policy proposition. And we've seen some glimpses in a few African countries of what is possible also in that direction. Might in fact also help us to unleash new energy, new ideas for the kind of innovations in politics, economy, and society that Brian Kagoro pointed to. I think Beans Gawana's your emphasis on leadership, and you talked about leadership that is empathetic. And I hear you, and I actually would even say I'd adhere to that proposition. My problem with it is actually not so much with the idea of an empathetic leadership, but the conditions that will necessarily compel that kind of leadership, because a lot of the times social positioning is of a kind which actually blinds people to the lived reality of the majority of the people whom they actually govern. And I'm sorry to say that many of us who exercise positions of leadership and authority actually don't know our societies as well as we ought to. We're so alienated from the societies we preside over. We are more up to date about the conversations that take place in New York that don't really concern us, about conversations that take place in Paris and London, in the metropolises, than we are about the pulse of our own society and of what makes people to tick and what makes them on a day-to-day basis to function according to the logic of the system over which we preside. And that extraverted logic, I think Brian Kagoro also made allusions to it, that extraverted logic permeates all sectors of society. You know, we don't have that instinct of responding to internal dynamics, but more of responding to external processes and pressures. And I think this is where we ought, I think, to be rethinking and resituating leadership, of a leadership that defines dignity as a starting point, that is self-assured and confident in itself, that has that confidence embedded in a relationship of trust with the populace. And my friend Victor Ayeni says, what will it take for us to be able to achieve that kind of trust? Victor, as a compatriot of mine, you know that it doesn't actually take too much in many of our countries for a purposeful leadership to win the confidence of the populace, just as it doesn't take much for the populace to write off and discount a leadership within a period of 6 months of being elected, simply because people have seen through it and understand that it is not going to change the equation. So leadership that is able to anchor itself in a broadly shared vision and which is faithful to that vision is indispensable to the restoration of trust. The burden in this instance, in my view, is not primarily one that is located with the citizens as takers, but actually one that is located in the kind of leadership that is thrown up by the political processes that we operate on the continent. And there, I'm sorry to say that those processes have more often than not thrown up leadership that has left a lot to be desired, preoccupied with things which may matter to them in political society, but do not really speak to the concerns of the generality of the people in terms of securing a better livelihood and in living in peace and dignity. Over.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have a contribution from His Excellency Ambassador Melvin Gates, permanent representative of Namibia. Please, you have the floor.
Moderator, thank you very much for giving me the floor. It has certainly been a while since we had such a rich and instructive discussion on such a transparent and frank way. I can only say hats off to USG Beans Governors and OSAA for organizing this excellent dialogue series. No question, the panelists have all been outstanding contributors to the topics under discussion. Thank you once again for showing great resilience and dedication to serving the interests of our people of the continent. Moderator, the discussions that we've just listened to, I couldn't agree with it more. I think the question that our professor has just addressed in terms of what can we do to strengthen trust, in Namibia, we have adopted a formula that our president is taking charge of, where he is advocating greater transparency and accountability would help us to strengthen trust amongst the population. Of course, we are also talking about trust in leadership this morning. So I would argue strongly that we need to encourage the populace to demand more transparency and hold their leaders accountable if we are to see greater trust developed in their leadership capabilities, but also in receiving trust from the community. Mr. Gagoro raised a point that I wanted to make earlier, and I think it is really worth noting that the role that external parties play in governance, in influencing governance or affecting governance on the continent is critical. It's an issue we need to focus more on. For as long as there are vested interests from parties outside of the continent, we are going to struggle for a long time to get the balance, to get the kind of corporate governance or governance, good governance that Africa should have and needs to have for its own development, peace and stability. While I have the floor, I just want to reiterate that, or to remind us all that our efforts should be aimed at protecting the most vulnerable, women and children, people with disabilities, displaced and refugees, who bear the brunt during all types of conflicts that we see on the continent and in the world at large. The weak and fractured healthcare systems in Africa and limited resources to address the pandemic that we have currently has the potential to severely impact the most vulnerable. Ceasing conflicts to focus on battling COVID-19 is therefore a noble action in this regard. As has been said countless times, this pandemic may also be an opportunity for us to build back better, whether it be in the security, economic, education, or health sectors, to mention but a few. Lastly, Namibia would like to appeal for action which charts a post-COVID-19 recovery that leads to a more peaceful, sustainable, and prosperous future for Africa. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I think we have about 10 minutes left. Two questions before I ask the lead presenter and the discussants to make their final comments. I just want to read them out for you from Mr. Ayobayo Babade. How can, in practical terms, youth inclusion be achieved in Africa? And then we also have another question, if I can just give me a minute here, from Sheikh Tijane Ndongo to all panelists. Fruitful and insightful interventions by the panelists. My question is, what are the biggest governance challenges for sustainable development in Africa? So those are our last two questions to the discussants. And I will start this round, the final round, with giving the floor to Your Excellency, Mrs. Susuma. Please, you have the floor. Your Excellency, are you still online?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I am saying some are comment, and I fully agree with intervention and some questions about to invest in the health. And as African Union, at the beginning of this COVID-19, our Minister of Health had meetings, and head of state also had a virtual meeting, and we adopt strategy, and in which we focus on to invest in health strategy. I would like to comment about how build trust at the level of citizen. I want to say that we need to address the health issue, and particularly about vulnerable people. We have to take account of them. And also, I fully agree with Namibia, transparency, accountability in managing funds, and also natural resources. We need to highlight that one. And participatory governance, consensus-oriented governance. We need our citizens, especially youth and women, needs responsive, effective, and efficient governance. We need equitable and inclusion governance. We need respect of human rights and rule of law, and particularly in election. People, our young people, they don't trust authority. Why? Because we used to change constitution. We have to give chance to new generation to be on board also. And we cannot do that one without women. We cannot do that one without young people and private sector. That's why we dedicate the theme of 2017 on youth to find a solution to have them. And to finish, I fully agree about women. We as African Union, we take this decision to have gender parity, and also to have about 30-35% of young youth in our organization, and we are working on that one. This is for good governance at the Union and also in Africa. We cannot do that one, and highlight the importance of multilateralism in Africa, and also a coordination between us and others, REX and the UN and other partners. And also we need coordination, especially now with this COVID, internally in our member state, and also between Africans, and also with the rest of the world. I fully agree with comment about closing borders. Closing borders, this time we don't have only CFTA, we have a free movement, which is not taking going far, because we have just 4 ratification, and it is not fair. If we have all, we need Africa, the Africa we want, we need women, we need young people, we need trust to our authorities, and without all these things, we cannot have good governance. We won't have peace, security, stability in Africa. We won't manage well our resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And now I'd like to call upon USG Gowanus, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the interventions. Trust in leadership, it's very fundamental in terms of the discussions that we have. And it is fundamental to the extent that I believe that the only way people will trust leadership or trust government is when we are able to breach the inequality gap that exists within our societies. We are talking about leave no one behind. We are talking about people should not feel excluded. But as long as there are people that are poor, that are marginalized, that are vulnerable, to the exclusion of those that are rich, I don't think people will have trust in their leaders. I do also agree with the question of transparency and accountability, but I always want to know, how do citizens hold their leaders accountable? Sometimes I get the feeling that that leadership or governments are accountable more to the external rather than to the people. So how does one create accountability mechanisms? Now, people will say, yes, every 4 years there are elections and people can vote leaders out of power if they are not delivering. But we know that that is not always happening. So I want to really see greater transparency, but it has to take a leader to create that transparency. Otherwise, it will not happen. The same with accountability mechanisms. What mechanisms do exist through which the citizens can hold their governments accountable without having to vote them, to vote them out of power? Lastly, conflicts are costly, and we have seen what destruction they cause on the continent. I would therefore say it is still important that we invest in prevention. And the best way in which we can prevent conflicts is, again, as I said earlier, to invest in people's livelihoods and to make sure that we deal with inequalities within our societies. That is, for me, the biggest challenges of governance. Thank you.
USG. And now we have our final discussant to close off our discussion. And before he takes the floor, I just want to read the last question that we have received. And Brian, you have to deal with this one. It's from Caroline Ruching at the University of Warwick. And she says that I'm extremely grateful for the trajectory of the conversations over the last 24 hours. Thank you for this fruitful and constructive discussion on silencing the guns in Africa. My question is, what are the policies that your respective governments have put in place to promote positive masculinity and discourage toxic masculinity? How can youth such as myself in the diaspora add value to this mission? Brian, you have the floor.
Caroline, I think that most of our governments have put in place gender equality laws, but I'm sad to say to you that gender equality laws do not address toxic masculinity. Partly because we are, through social media and other platforms, modeling a narcissistic type of leadership, almost putting the patriarchy that Beans Gawanas and her generation contested. We've put it on steroids. It's now not in the bodies of old men with gray hairs, but young who can flaunt it on social media. So this will have to be a new terrain of struggle and renegotiation that's not only contained by policy, but that needs to be contained by social action. Toxic masculinity is also pervaded through religion. The takeover of our politics and economy by religion, and this is not to say people should not be religious, but particular types of faithpreneurship have projected a very toxic masculinity. And it is important, therefore, in addressing this, that we look at a multi-dimensional approach that looks at the social responsibility of social actors, but that also looks at the public responsibility. Having said that, I think, let me link that to including young people generally. And I see the 6 trends, Chairperson, securocracy, financialization, and digitalization as being linked. So democracy and state capture that we will someday talk about, the rise of monopolies and oligopolies, whether it's big pharmaceuticals, big venture capitalists, or big tech. And what COVID-19 has done is actually enabled that, a lot more of that. These entities are not accountable within the national framework. So one of the solutions is to ensure that we have regional frameworks and global frameworks to hold big pharmaceuticals, big tech, and other entities to account. Otherwise, multilateralism of states that is constructed on the old thinking that states are the primary actors ignored the fact that some big corporations' budgets are bigger than the GDP of 20 African countries put together. And therefore, their ability to purchase governments, to influence policy is huge. The second is securitization. We're seeing militarization of our politics, not just the COVID response. This is linked to the governance challenge of impunity. And if we are to challenge impunity, we need to be vigilant in enforcing the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. And we've seen, for example, a projection of leadership in Botswana, where the leader self-quarantines, not because he has COVID, but as part of their accountability. We have seen in South Africa the attempt to include a broad spectrum of political and social actors. So there are snippets of countries where leaders are beginning to show some measure of humility and accountability. But this would not actually be fully functional if we didn't say the problem of public goods and public services is not. So what am I cautioning against? When we had HIV and AIDS, all money was going to AIDS. Then we had Ebola. All money must go to Ebola. Today we have this pandemic. The single issue panacea approach is actually an expression of dysfunction. Most of our countries have social policies that are not linked to economic policies. So we tend to react to pandemics as one-off events. When we have done the response, we are no more resilient than we were before to be able to meet other pandemics. So it's important that we learn from Ebola, and the West African community, West African governments did well on Ebola. You mobilize community response, you mobilize expertise, your human capital, you mobilize your local or regional finance, you also mobilize your political will and commitment. And we are seeing this as key, but public goods and public resources and public services are key to silencing the guns. The other thing that's key to silencing the guns is ensuring, as Professor Olukoshi said, that your policies are not responding to external stimuli, but they are responding to internal realities. Now, let me clarify internal, because when COVID hit, most of our countries faced inwards, and they behaved as though every little African country could save itself from a global pandemic by closing out its neighbors. Now, most of our countries are not viable economically as single entities. Regional integration is not a feel-good. It is not just a political imperative. It is an existential and economic imperative. Otherwise, we'll all be cherry-picked by more powerful nations if we don't come together for a collective voice and collective position. And lastly, Chair, justice must not be conceptualized purely as what we do to please international donors. Our African societies were founded on the notions of justice, of dignity, and of fairness. Until we model our modern society on the basis of inclusion, of justice, of fairness, and accountability, the problem of impunity will eat development for supper, for lunch, and for breakfast. As long as a leadership remains unaccountable. So what have we seen an example? So the Rwandans, for example, it is the government itself, not because there are demonstrations on the streets, that has concerned itself with ensuring that there's minimal corruption, that they use resources they receive from outside and internally, they use them in a particular way. Now, I'm not saying it is a perfect system. I'm simply saying, for Victor who was asking, where do we begin to look at solutions? First solution, deal with the public sector leadership, not the elected, but the selected, the public administration. Decouple it from political control and clientelism. Ensure that it serves as an entity to deliver service to the citizen. For many of our countries, we've politicized the public service, and in its politicization, we've taken out merit In taking out merit, we've elevated mediocrity to a place where it's become sacrosanct. So, Chair.
Mr. Kagoro, if we may please wrap up now, because we are running out of time, and we have technicians we need to take into account.
My last point, citizenship. You know, European and American organizations sometimes find it easier to access the African Union and to be in sensitive meetings where there's a discussion of African affairs than African organizations. The historical hostility where African civil society and governments see each other as sworn enemies cannot be sustained post-COVID, because what is needed to respond is a trust. And how do you build that trust? Through greater interaction, through greater exchange, through open and constructive criticism of each other. As long as we see each other as enemies, where you have civil society, private sector, and you have religious sector and traditional sector, then Africa is easy picking for imperial interest and for hostile private interest. So my parting short is simple, Chair, that the solution lies in a mutually accountable partnership between African states, African business, African civil society, and African faith institutions and traditional institutions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kagoro, for those thought-provoking words and your contribution. Your Excellencies, USG, governors, distinguished guests and participants, thank you so much for devoting your time, more than 2 hours, in this conversation, where we're looking at the issue of good governance, leadership, and people-centered sustainable development in Africa as part of the Africa Dialogue series, whose theme this year is COVID-19 and silencing the guns in Africa, challenges and opportunities. For me to try to attempt to summarize the rich discussion that we've had, I think I'll do a grave injustice to all the participants and also the contributions from the floor. All that remains for me to do is once again to thank USG governors and their team for organizing this dialogue series, for bringing to the fore discussions on issues which are critical to how Africa makes a difference in its development. Transformative change going forward. We cannot go back to business as usual the way we've been since independence. I'd like to thank our lead presenter, Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, and our three discussants, Your Excellency, Mrs. Sesuma, and USG governors, and Mr. Brian Kagoro. Thank you for highlighting some of the key issues, some of the controversial issues, which really gave us some food for thought. I also want to thank our participants who contributed from the floor, those who wrote in, and hopefully everyone had something to get out of this conversation. So all that remains for me is to wish you a good afternoon to all of you who are in New York, and good evening and good night to all those who are in other parts of the world. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you. Thank you, my colleague Munyadzi Chenje, for your excellent worship of this very lively session. So many eloquently expressed ideas, incisive and very frank. Thank you very much. So this not only brings us to the end of session 5, but also to day 2 of the ADS 2020. We will resume tomorrow morning, New York time, with the next very important session, session 6, on women, peace, security, and development. We start sharp at 8:30 a.m. New York time, not the earlier start time tomorrow. So until then, a very good night and a very good rest of the day for those of you who are still in daylight time. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.